This is one of a series of webinars we're coordinating this year with the theme of the Northridge earthquake 30 years later, a catalyst for engineering resilient communities. And you can see this, the events that have happened. We've had one webinar so far. The recording is available already. Others coming up. We'll talk a little bit more about those at the very end today. But you go to earthquakecountry.org/Northridge/events for links to those webinars. The partners include of this series, the American Society of Civil Engineers Infrastructure Resilience Division, the ASCE Los Angeles section, Earthquake Engineering Research Institute, Southern California chapter, the Structural Engineers Association of Southern California, and the Earthquake Country Alliance, led by the Statewide California Earthquake Center, where I'm based. My name is Mark Benthian, Director for Communication, Education, and Outreach for SCEC, and Executive Director of Earthquake Country Alliance. Today's episode, episode 2, is Insurance Issues and Impacts Following the Northridge Earthquake. Again, where you registered is where the recording will be. There at earthquakecountry.org/Northridge30-webinar 2. And we're really pleased to have our presenters today. We'll get right to Charlie Scawthorn and Janiele Maffei. And so, Charlie, you're going to take over, share your slides, and your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Hope you can see my screen. And let's see, I have to go to, whoops, I was looking at flower seeds, sorry.
Don't see that, but just.
Yeah, there we go. Okay.
There you go.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. And hello, everyone. Good day, no matter where you are, even on the Oregon coast. I see we have someone from there. And it's my pleasure to speak today about the insurance issues following the Northridge earthquake. The Northridge earthquake was a seminal event. There have been several seminal earthquake events for the United States, and Northridge was definitely one. And it had quite a bit of impact on the insurance industry. And so I wish to speak to that. But to give you, to get to the Northridge earthquake, I'm going to go through quite a bit of background. And I'm going to explain insurance and loss estimation practices both prior to and at the time of the 1994 Northridge earthquake and some issues that emerged. And to do that, the outline of my presentation is here. I'm going to relatively briefly go through insurance practices in general, the same with regard to earthquake insurance, then changes in the insurance industry practices from the 60s through the 90s, what I term the rise of the modelers, which I'll explain, and the performance of the modelers' loss estimation in the 94 Northridge earthquake. I will stop basically in 94 or 95, and Janiele will follow me and tell you how particularly the CEA has taken up the burden since then. With regard to, let me just see if I can move some of these. Okay. To go to insurance background, insurance, is nearly as old as seafaring. I mean, there's at least recorded insurance 3,000 years ago. Really, modern insurance got its birth in the Great London Fire of 1666, and then the birth of or the gathering of people willing to buy and sell risk at a coffee shop in London called run by a man named Lloyd, which became Lloyd's of London, and that more or less was formalized as a market in 1688. All through the 1700s, insurance grew both in Europe and so on. Ben Franklin was heavily involved in insurance. There are fire marks. If you go to the East Coast, you can still see fire marks on some buildings in Philadelphia and New York. And those are not the signs of fire. They are the signs of the insurance companies insuring that building. With the Industrial Revolution, however, we had increasing size of risks, larger factories, particularly in the Northeast, and the rise of mutual insurance companies. The factory mutual system is the consolidation of all the mutual insurance companies at that time. And as these risks became larger and larger, there came to be a need to share or reinsure the risks. But so a company that was insuring various properties wanted to share some of its risk or reinsure it with another entity, but it didn't want to do that with its competitors in the neighborhood because they would then be learning about the customers of the first company. So they developed the practice of reinsuring with people outside your region, particularly in London. Much of North America in the 17 and 1800s was being reinsured in London via various mechanisms, some of which were called treaties with so-called foreign companies. This practice was not only in the United States, but in Europe, and the Hamburg fire of 1842 led to the birth of the first actual stock company for reinsurance purposes, which was Cologne Re. It's the first reinsurance company. The Cologne Re still exists. It's not in the same league with the two giants, Swiss Reinsurance and Munich Reinsurance, who were founded some years later, and they are two of the two largest reinsurance companies in the world. In the United States, American Reinsurance was founded in 1917, Employers Re in 1914, so they're American reinsurers also. Which brings us up to 1906, another seminal event. And the San Francisco fire, there was no earthquake insurance at that time. None of the properties were insured for earthquake. They were insured, however, for fire. That was what insurance was, property insurance was all about in those days. And the tremendous losses, $250 million in 19 hours. And some of the European insurers either reneged or only paid a few cents on the dollar, but Lloyd's paid 100%. There's a famous telegram that was sent from London to San Francisco, instructing the Lloyd's agents to just pay claims on site, and this made Lloyd's reputation in the United States. So again, no earthquake losses. It's interesting to note, by the way, 1906 fire, the flow of gold from the UK, from London to the United States to pay for the claims on that insurance caused the 1907 panic. And this is well documented. The economic impacts of that earthquake are not well known, but they were quite large. What is insurance? I'm talking about insurance and reinsurance. So let me just briefly diagram it out here. You see a bunch of houses down at the bottom. These are single properties. You live in one, I live in another, and so on. From an insurer point of view, this is that insurer's portfolio. He has a portfolio of properties, and he has the risks associated with each one of these. And these risks are illustrated here by these squiggly lines. The x-axis is time, and the y-axis is the amount of money that the insurer will pay out over time. And some years he pays out very little. Other years there will be a large claim that the insurer pays on each of those properties. Of course, many years there'll be none. So the real point here is that for any particular property, there's a large amount of uncertainty. And if the insurer tried to accumulate all the money to cover all of these, taking into account the peaks of the claims that would occur, it wouldn't be feasible for the insurer to do that. And moreover, it's not necessary because there's something called the law of large numbers, which operates in the world in general and as fundamental to the insurance industry. So what happens is the insurance company, through the law of large numbers, actually reduces the variation, or what's called the variance, of the losses, so that the squiggles get a little bit more even. But still, that's quite a bit there of uncertainty. And the insurance company wants to manage its risk the same as an individual person wants to insure their property and manage their risk. So the insurance companies reinsure with a reinsurance company. The reinsurance company is simply an insurance company for other insurers. And as you can see, the squiggles for the reinsurance company become almost a flat line. In other words, the losses and the risk are highly predictable, easily predictable, and highly predictable. And this is a snapshot of how the insurance industry works. And we'll come back to that, but that's a little bit of background. So these are loss over time risks. Now, The risk is also known as the pure premium, is broken into several parts. Actually, the premium you pay or I pay is equal to the pure premium uh, plus the profit plus the overhead the insurance company has to pay. So calculation of the pure premium or the actual claims that will be paid is a fundamental part of insurance. And that calculation is fundamentally the intersection of three basic attributes of any property. And that is the hazard it is subjected to, such as earthquake, if it's close or far from the fault, if it's on liquefiable soil, whatever, the vulnerability of that property, and the values. Of course, higher values, higher risk. But with regard to the vulnerability, depending on the attributes of the building, whether it's a wood frame building, concrete, steel, old, new, soft story, whatever, the vulnerability is different, and that affects the risk. And this is true for fire, such as shown here, a fire in San Francisco recently, or for earthquake. This is from the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. So to understand those vulnerabilities, going back to almost to London in 1666, but certainly in the 1800s, there arose what was called insurance maps. And a number of companies would go out and map a city, each property in the city. One of the best known of those companies was the Sanborn Insurance Company. And this is, excuse me, the Sanborn Insurance Map Company. And this is their map drawn for San Francisco, a portion of San Francisco. You can see the piers down at the foot there. And actually, Market Street is on the left in 1905. And the reason those pages look a little torn and worn is that this book went through the 1906 earthquake and fire. Now, what were these maps? Every city block was mapped. And if we zoom in, you can see that every building was actually mapped at the time. And you can see that the mapping was very detailed. It showed you the number of stories. The color showed you what material the building was made out of. It was brick or concrete or wood. The locations of the stairs, the locations of any sprinklers, windows, hazardous materials, everything was mapped out, and including the water pipes in the street for firefighting. You can see on the left there the 8-inch water pipe, both running north-south and east-west. So when a property owner wanted to buy insurance, he or she would go down to the broker, and the broker would open the book and look at the building. And this had all been mapped out, and these were kept current by the Sanborn Map Company. They go out every year and inspect. And based on that, the underwriter, the broker or the underwriter, could quote a price for the insurance. So the point is, the insurance industry was data driven. I mean, they had very detailed data on all buildings in all cities in the United States, and similar maps were made for the UK and for the continents also. Now, with regard to earthquake insurance, as I said before, there was no earthquake insurance in 1906. The insurers only paid fire losses at that time. A man named John Freeman, who's a pioneer in the field of earthquake insurance, wrote a very influential book in 1932. The title of the book is Earthquake Damage and Earthquake Insurance. And this is a quote that earthquake insurance is relatively new in 1932. It was almost unheard of in 06, and in Santa Barbara in 25, only about 10% of the properties damaged had any earthquake insurance. Another way to say that, the parlance that's used in the industry, is that the penetration of the earthquake market was only about 10%, 1/10. Earthquake insurance became a more common commodity in various countries. New Zealand instituted it in what's called the Earthquake and War Claims Commission, 1945. Japan created a national earthquake insurance program in 1966. The 1960s, the U.S. established a national flood insurance program, but not an earthquake program. 1971, at the time of the San Fernando earthquake, there was relatively little market penetration, relatively little earthquake insurance at that time. However, following that, the demand increased dramatically, both for earthquake and for hurricane insurance in Florida, both what's called CATs, catastrophes. And as a result, the insurance industry, in order to better understand what their risks were, created the insurance industry created one mechanism called CRESTA zones, which I'll explain in a moment, and the California Department of Insurance, because of the increasing demand for earthquake insurance, did something which I'll explain also. The CRESTA zones are, CRESTA is an acronym. It stands for Catastrophic Risk Evaluating and Standardizing Target Accumulations. Here is an example of the CRESTA zones in California and in Japan, by the way, and there was similar maps for all countries in the world. So CRESTA was a system set up by the large insurance companies and reinsurance companies to understand what their accumulations were. In other words, how many risks they had, how much money was at risk, at a fairly discrete level, as you can see here. By the way, CRESTA has this, as I said, it's an acronym with this name, but actually the name comes from the fact that the meeting where it was created was at the Hotel Cresta. And so the acronym is sort of a back calculation. It was developed in the late 70s, a joint project. So all the reinsurers would require their primary insurance companies that they were reinsuring to report their exposures, in other words, the amount of money that they was at risk, according to each zone. It was a key system employed by reinsurers for tracking cat exposure and a method for reporting to reinsurance companies and so on. At the same time, the California Department of Insurance created a similar system for California. As a matter of fact, they used virtually the same zones as the CRESTA zones. Or actually, they created those zones in California, then CRESTA adopted them to be consistent. This is the each year, the California Department of Insurance would require each company writing earthquake insurance in California to provide a report, a questionnaire. So it must report. ML factors were specified. These are the actual factors here, depending upon what zone you were in, zone A being the highest risk and so on, and what the deductible was. And based on this, the Department of Insurance could make an estimate of how much the insurance company might, how many claims, how much in claims an insurance company might suffer after a major earthquake. And then they could look at their balance sheet to make sure, since the department is the regulator, that the public was properly protected. And this system, by the way, was developed by Carl Steinbrugge and a man at the insurance department named Roth, who were pioneers in this regard. And this is an example of the report from 2023, I believe, of the summary of the latest data call. And I want to point out, I'm not going to go through all these numbers, of course, but I want to point out a couple of things. First of all, of companies writing earthquake insurance for properties in California. So it's not all insurance companies, it's only those offering earthquake insurance. They have 12 million policies, 12,782,000 policies, with a total sum insured approaching $5 trillion. Now, that doesn't mean that any one earthquake is going to cause $5 trillion in losses. This would be if earthquake destroyed every house in California in the same year, and that would be highly unlikely. So that's the amount, that's the size of the market, so to speak. Of that market, only about 12% actually of the people owning those 12 million properties, only about 12% actually purchase earthquake insurance, which means that only about 1.5 million, and this is the residential market, I'm not going to go into the commercial. That means only about 1.5 million residences in California purchase earthquake insurance. And the total amount, sum insured, is on the order of $870 billion. So in other words, only about 20% of the almost 5 trillion that is total sums at risk. Of this, by the way, CEA, and Janiele will talk more about this, covers about 2/3 of that market. So CEA is really important to the market. But this is a statewide average. So again, the key number to keep in mind here is about 1.5 million policies for earthquake in homes in California. But those 1.5 million properties are not uniformly distributed. People, for example, in the valley where we believe earthquake risk is relatively low, very few of those people buy earthquake insurance. These risks are concentrated in Southern California, the Los Angeles Basin, San Diego, and up in the Bay Area, where the earthquake risk is high. So this is an example of what's called adverse selection, in the sense that only the people with the highest risks are buying the insurance. So it's not averaged out over the entire population. And these numbers are for shaking damage only. There's no coverage, virtually no coverage for landslide or liquefaction, small amounts. Janiele may explain that. And fire isn't covered after an earthquake. Excuse me, it is not covered by the earthquake policy. It is covered under the fire policy. So people are insured for fire after earthquake. And actually, whereas only 12% of people are insured for earthquake, virtually everyone is insured for fire. So the total sums insured for fire are much larger than the numbers shown here. So let me just a few things here. In the 1980s, the situation was earthquake insurance was available at a very low price, a few $100s. The deductibles were very low, but increasing demand, as I mentioned, there was 20% market penetration about 1980, and it was rising. It was increasing. In the 1960s to 80s, there was a drift by the insurance industry away from expensive data collection, the Sanborn maps towards loss-based underwriting. In a sense, it was statistically based. If there hasn't been a loss, it must be a good risk. The companies knew almost nothing about the homes they insured. They'd lost all that Sanborn data. And I, working with insurance companies in the 1980s, I'd say, I can analyze your portfolio if you just tell me where the buildings are. And they gave me the addresses, and I noticed, for example, that dozens of houses were insured on Market Street, Lower Market Street in the financial district in San Francisco. And I said, there's no houses there. And they said, well, that's where we mailed the bill. So I said, well, where's the house? And they said, we have no idea. That's where we mailed the bill. That's all they knew. So the insurance industry had really drifted away, and its underwriting practices were not very good. In '84, following Coalinga, they started to require there was a mandatory offering where the insurance companies had to offer earthquake insurance and asymmetry of information. Swiss Re and Munich Re had a much better handle on the risk than the primary insurance companies. And as a result, it became a market to provide information to insurance companies and to insureds. And several companies, the modeling companies, emerged. And those are RMS, AIR Worldwide, and a company called EquiCat. And I was one of the founders of EquiCat. In the interest of time, I'm going to go through this very quickly. This is just a timeline of some of the things that led to the modeling. That was the background. There was Steinbrügge was one of the key people. Computation, Moore's law, the computational capacity increased dramatically. Cornell produced a methodology for probabilistic hazard estimation, which was then extended by McGuire to probabilistic loss risk information. Various other things emerged here. The companies like Applied Insurance, AIR, Insurance Research, and EquiCat were founded in the 80s and so on. So, and the modelers took a much more rational, scientifically based, and data-driven approach to estimating the risk. They calculated the hazard on the upper curve and the vulnerability curves on the lower curve, and combining these, you get what's called the loss exceedance curve, which allowed a much more precise, rational basis for estimating earthquake loss. So basically, we had a convergence of probabilistic methods, computational power, and the three modeling companies. AIR, as I mentioned, it was primarily a top-down approach to what the risk would be from the broker perspective. EQE, I was one of the founders. It was an engineering approach from the bottom up, starting with the hazard and vulnerability. And RMS at Stanford, founded by Professor Shah and Wei-Min Dong, and they were interested more in the financial aspects, but a bottom-up approach also. There was little interest at first by the insurance industry in this, but starting with the '87 Whittier Narrows earthquake, Prieta, Hurricane Hugo, and particularly the Hurricane Andrew in 1992, where the losses were very large, the insurance companies came to see that they had dropped the ball and they needed the services of the modeling companies. And this brings us to 1994 Northridge, where the modelers were able to produce losses very quickly. As a matter of fact, this map, the Northridge earthquake, was at about 5 a.m. on January the 17th, 1994. And this map was produced by 10 a.m. that day. My group at EQE produced it. This is the first real-time or near real-time map of earthquake shaking that was ever produced in near real time. And this we produced this by 10 a.m. By noon, we were working on what the losses would be. By about 2 p.m., we had estimated what the losses would be statewide or in the event. And we got a phone call from the governor's office that afternoon. Did we have an estimate of the losses? And we did. And we had a phone call with the governor's office at that time. And that is all documented in the Wall Street Journal. It's shown here. And this is 4 days after the earthquake. The article, the state damage estimate was based on models by EQE. We estimated about $15 billion in overall losses. And some with details here, you'll notice at the bottom, insured losses on the order of $1.5 to $1.9 billion, $1.5 to say $2 billion approximately. This was used by Governor Wilson, by the way, to negotiate a presidential declaration with President Clinton the next day. So these numbers have more or less stood the test of time. This is an article in the LA Daily News from this year, on the 30th anniversary, saying that the quake cost about $20 billion in property damage, and so on. You notice our insurance losses were we estimated the insured losses were on the order of $1.5 to $2 billion. Well, we did that very fast. How accurate was it? Well, this is an article I wrote for the Society of Actuaries in 1995 on how well or how we did. I wouldn't say how well we did, how we did. And the estimates of insured losses are shown here. EQE, we produced those losses the next day, 1.5 to 1.9 billion. AIR estimated a broader range, 600 million to 2.3 billion. RMS 1.5 to 2, like EQE. Risk engineering 1.7. So all in the same ballpark. PCS, which is the Property Casualty Insurance Company, which actually gets reports from insurers of what they think they're going to lose, was already estimating $2.5 billion on February the 7th, a few weeks later. They couldn't. This shows why you want modelers. PCS, the day after the earthquake, had no idea what the losses would be because they have to wait for the insurers who have no idea yet what it's going to be. So that's why you want modeling. However, these losses continue to climb. PCS's estimates, which are actual reports of the losses, on February the 7th were $2.5 billion. By April, they were approaching 5. By August, approaching 7 or over 7. And a year later, over $10 billion in insured losses. So we grossly underestimated the losses. Why was that? Well, there's a number of factors. I'll go through them very quickly. We had, first of all, we had on the morning of the January 17th, we didn't have accurate seismological data. The magnitude was a little off. That wasn't so important, but the epicentral location we understood to be further away from central Los Angeles than it turned out to be. So that was an important factor. It was closer to central LA. Second, the ground motions were extraordinarily high. They were above average because of the nature of the rupture. It was a hidden thrust fault. Another point was underinsurance. Many people had, for example, maybe the replacement value for the house was $500 million, and they were insuring maybe for 200, replacement value was $500,000, and they were insuring, their policy was for say $200,000, which means they weren't paying enough in premium, but more importantly, they had a full replacement policy, which meant the insurer thought they were going to lose at most $200,000, and in reality, they lost $500,000. So underinsurance, which also results in a lower deductible, by the way. Adjusting practices were not taken into account. We estimated damage, not actually what the insurance company would have to pay to repair the damage, which are two different things. There was adverse selection, as I've mentioned. The market penetration in LA was much higher than most people estimated, about 25%. EQE estimated 35%. It was actually about 40%. Deductibles, lower deductibles in those days. There was hidden nature of the earthquake damage that it took time for people to discover it, and go into this in more detail. There was also what's called short-term inflation, also called demand surge, where prices of materials and labor went up for a few months, and that cost more to repair. So in conclusion, the models then and now are only as good as the data provided. And in the Northridge earthquake, at least two critical data sets, the ground motions and the adverse selection, were inaccurate. Should we have anticipated all this? Yes. We learned from it, and the modelers have gone on since then to spent a lot of time and effort, invested much in improving these models, taking into account demand surge and so on and so forth. With that, I'll stop and hand it off to Janiele, and thank you very much. And I look forward to your questions. Over to you, Janiele.
Charlie, just
Thanks.
one second before you get
Yeah, go
started,
ahead.
Neil, just seeing if I just prompted people for questions, but anyone have a question for Charlie on his presentation? Just give a moment.
It was a lot to absorb. I'm sure the questions will emerge.
Yeah, and so you can put your questions into the Q&A. Janiele will go ahead and get started. Charlie can answer them by text in the Q&A, so everybody can look for answers to questions there as well. And then get.
So Mark, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can
Yes,
see
we
it.
do, and you are set to go. Thank you, Janiele.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, it is a pleasure to be here. And thank you. Charlie gave me a preview of his slides, and I said, that's all the background that goes into the way I usually start a presentation, whereas I say modeling was in its infancy. So it's like one sentence you just covered so brilliantly. I really appreciate that. And all that information is really important. So I am the Chief Mitigation Officer. I manage the mitigation research departments at the California Earthquake Authority. I'm a structural engineer, joined in 2011. And decided not to talk about the policy. You know, I really recommend all of you should be reading your insurance policies, whichever ones you have. But rather to talk about, some of the issues that Charlie talked about and how the CEA has addressed them, how some of them still exist, how, the changing economy affects earthquake insurance, and then, maybe where we should be headed. And they're really just amusing about that. Why the CEA exists is pretty simple. 2/3 of our nation's earthquake risk right here in California. I did a quick calculation using census data, and about 80% of our population lives in that, what you could call the San Andreas fault zone, which is the San Andreas, and then of course the series of faults either side of it. So I joke, but I said we strategically placed a huge percentage of our population in harm's way, which just means that it matters. And want to tell you briefly about the California Earthquake Authority, a little background. We're not a not-for-profit residential earthquake insurer. The CEA is not an agency. It's very important. And created, there was one more little piece of legislation that happened in the 80s, 1984, when the MAC came out. California legislatures passed the mandatory offer law. It specifically took earthquake insurance out of the fire policy or the homeowners policy, but wanted it to be available to homeowners. And so they said, if you sell a homeowners policy in California, you must offer earthquake insurance. The homeowner is not obligated to purchase it, but it must be offered to them. So as Charlie said, there's some companies that kept, still have their own insurance. CEA was created after the Northridge earthquake, and there are some other private companies that offer earthquake insurance in California, kind of outside of that homeowners policy. So magnitude 6.7 Northridge earthquake struck. I was a consulting engineer. I was in my 30s. I remember being at Heavenly Valley with my family because it was Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and thinking that this was going to change my life. And it did. I spent years down in the Northridge area, predominantly working on insurance claims, and predominantly for single family dwellings, most of the costliest natural disasters. 1994 dollars, as Charlie said, 20 billions in damage, so not economic. Severe damage, 22,000 people homeless. And we're going to talk predominantly about residential. So that homeless is very, very important. I want to talk about habitability, which is a difficult topic. And huge crisis. Insurance companies stopped writing the homeowners insurance because of that mandatory offer. So it's very much like what we're seeing right now with wildfire in California. So a huge crisis in insurance, and of course, that crisis in the lending institutions because of that lack of insurance or the reduction in the market. So the legislature very quickly got together and created this publicly managed, privately financed. Charlie remembers that there was something similar in the 80s that was created that didn't really float, but this was a crisis. And so this was, very carefully put together, but very quickly put together. We are publicly managed. Our board consists of representatives, governor, insurance commissioner, state treasurer, from the assembly speaker, Senate rules chair, but privately financed, not part of the state budget. The money comes from participating insurers. I'll show you a slide with who they are. And then, of course, from the premiums that we get from our policyholders. We were charged with educate, mitigate, and insure from day one. And mitigate and educate, why were those thrown at the CEA? Those allow us to not be taxed on the premiums that we collect. So that outward-facing nature to not just policyholders allows us to have tremendous savings. And I'll show you how much the mitigation program gets versus hundreds of millions of dollars in really tax relief from this very carefully created organization. So there are the companies. We did not want to create like a second layer of insurance that just sat idly while there were no earthquakes, but rather is to work with these participating insurers to help them meet that mandatory offer. They actually sell the CEA policy along with their regular homeowners policy. In the event of an earthquake, you would call this company that you have your policy from. They would send an adjuster out to adjust your claim. The check would come from the California Earthquake Authority if in fact you have payment. Sometimes you'll hear a little bit about us being involved in wildfire. We've got this residential earthquake insurance that I mentioned. We've got the residential earthquake program that I'll talk about, but in the context of insurability. But I just wanted to mention, so if you hear us being related to wildfire, we don't have any insurance for homeowners in wildfire, but rather we simply manage the financing behind the California Wildfire Fund. That is intended for the major investor-owned utilities to keep them from bankruptcy. So essentially, we're overseeing this claim-paying capacity in the event that they would exhaust all of their funding in the event of a wildfire that is shown to be their fault. So let's go to this kind of insurability issue of the single family dwelling, and then a little bit about multifamily. I want to talk about a term, the claim-paying capacity. Claim-paying capacity. Insurance providers have to have funding on hand or accessible that's sufficient to assure policyholders filing a claim that they'll be paid all the benefits to which they're entitled. So it was interesting. Charlie helped me yesterday. We were talking about the replacement cost of a house and then kind of what you are due. And, it's important, once again, to understand that policy, because replacement cost certainly comes in, but there are limits on certain things, and there are, additions like, being able to pay you to live outside of your home. So very important that you understand it. But what we're doing is we're creating this claim-paying capacity, and that with permission and approval from our board, with a 1 in 350 chance in any given year, we need to be able to meet all of our expected liabilities. That is just over $19 billion for 1 million homeowners. And you can see on the left, the words are small, but essentially if Loma Prieta happened, it would make a dent in our capital. This is a funding tower, and we pay from the bottom up. So we have $6 billion in capital, huge amount of money in risk transfer, predominantly reinsurance, so insurance for insurance companies, some capital from revenue bonds, a little bit of policyholder surcharge and industry assessment layer for those participating insurers, but way at the top, those are. So it'd have to be a really, really huge earthquake. And you can see that Northridge today, if it happened in the same location, would only be just under a $12 billion hit to the CEA. So it would certainly be into the risk transfer. 1906 would just barely be above our risk transfer. There are certainly capabilities for larger earthquakes than that, but it's important to note that, when you get up there in those high, areas up there, you can see that probability. We're talking about a 0.29% possibility in any given year that you're going to have that $19 billion. So it's important to keep this picture in mind, because this is a huge piece of why earthquake insurance from the CEA is so incredibly expensive, and why we've had to make adjustments in our policy recently. The cost of capital is an important thing to understand. It's a global issue. It is not a local issue. Those reinsurers are predominantly offshore. You'll recognize Munich Re, in the Bahamas, Bermuda, very few in the United States. And all of them, of course, significantly affected by inflation, by climate change. And when I say climate change, predominantly the disasters related to climate change. And war can affect, just a blink in the global stock market can affect the cost of capital. And that's very important because those costs come right back directly and affect our policyholders with the cost of that reinsurance. And so with that continually rising in the past few years, as well as California's continued inflation, we're constantly battling inflation. I think all of us who live in California, we see the price of our house go up, that's great. But of course, if you want to go out and buy that next house, or if you want to do work on your house, all of that inflation, of course, directly affects our premiums. And insurance is important. And I wanted to mention just quickly, some of you, I know I saw your names on there. I talked about this just recently in a couple of meetings, but it's important to note that the government post-disaster response is not intended to be insurance. FEMA's assistance is there to help you and members of your household affected take care of necessary expenses and serious needs. That are not met through insurance or other forms of assistance. Those of you who work in this field know that a great deal is done by these non-government organizations, Red Cross, many religious organizations, and FEMA, in fact, really only comes into an area that's been affected by an earthquake with a presidentially declared disaster designation. I think Charlie mentioned how quickly they were able to respond to the state of California to get this disaster declaration after the Northridge earthquake. So these DR numbers have to be assigned to an earthquake. Ridgecrest had a DR number. The Humboldt earthquakes last year did not. So you had these very, very low to moderate income communities affected, small communities. The areas of significant damage were very small. The dollar amounts were very small. There was no FEMA individual assistance after that disaster. And I heard lots of obviously lamentation up there when I was up there. But of course, I wanted to carefully explain to them that even had FEMA come in, it's important to remember they are not insurance. Disaster assistance comes in the form of a small business administration loan, low interest, but it is a loan that's paid back with interest on top of your existing mortgage, or a FEMA disaster award, which is about $5,000 on average. The large money that we're looking at, for Sandy and Katrina came in after the Congress passed these enormous bills managed by HUD and by FEMA. Took years to distribute. We saw this huge diaspora out of those communities. So the importance of us having this ability to empower individuals to have some financial resilience is very important. So the CEA was created this mini policy, started out with just, I think, $1 billion, started growing in terms of policies, changed the policies in 2016 and went from 7,200 new policies every year to 50,000 new policies and started to grow. And then, of course, these financial impacts hit, and we had to really cut back on the policy. So there's my short description of the policy. But we've been looking very carefully at what else can we do? And that mindset actually started in 1996 after the Northridge earthquake. Standards, research, incentives. That mitigation, the idea was very important to create incentives. So here's that claimed paying capacity tower. There's that 19.4 billion in the enabling legislation for the CEA. It states that currently $6.1 billion of capital, or whatever we have at the time, invested conservatively, obviously. 5% of that investment income, up to $5 million a year, goes into a loss mitigation fund that is for mitigation, for not just policyholders, but for all of California. They had $25 million when I was hired in 2011. Had to do legislation to create my position to actually really put some teeth into the mitigation program with a very strong, declaration in legislation that it be for mitigation and for incentive programs. But in addition to that, we had some things that were missing. And these were things that the CEA actually had been involved in all along. There were some plan sets available for retrofit. So plan sets are pre-engineered retrofit plans so that homeowners and contractors can use that are a code, they're a standard but they can be utilized by do-it-yourselfers and by contractors without additional engineering. So the idea was, let's create these less expensive ways to mitigate these known vulnerabilities, as well as Charlie mentioned some of the, the reasons for just this outrageous cost of, of the damage after Northridge. I saw some of this cost. I mean, at the time, there were no standards, really. There were some standards for the claim adjustment, but not for the structural engineering that went on. And there was millions of dollars in lawsuits against these insurance companies for really claim, some of it they called fraud. And that's some of the work that I did. They weren't using the appropriate engineers. The engineers weren't trained. The claim adjusters, predominantly, there's not a lot of earthquakes, right? So they're all very, very, very versed in hurricane and flood. Huge numbers from Texas and Florida come into the state. But, earthquake damage is different. And so very important, we created these earthquake damage assessment and repair guidelines. And we started that process a long time ago. So FEMA P1100 is going through the ICC process to become model code. We're using it now in our incentive programs, and we have training available in our earthquake damage assessment and repair guidelines. Very important. It doesn't allow this runaway train of every crack that's in your house now is repaired after the earthquake as earthquake damage. The idea here is, let's be reasonable about earthquake damage, and let's talk about the important things. You're going to repair the concrete that is needed for egress and ingress into the house. The idea here is to put the house back into a not necessarily exactly as it was before. Some of the caps maybe won't allow that, but to get this house back into as close as possible to livable before an earthquake. So the 4 top damages that we see in these wood frame structures that the CEA, predominantly wood frame in California, that we insure: crawl space house, living space over garage, hillside house, chimney. Chimney has a $5,000 cap. We really should be taking these down, these unreinforced masonry chimneys. They not only do they come off the house or fall into the house, they're so heavy they can drive the response of the house. Hillside houses are covered in FEMA P1100, but you need an engineer. This picture here is from one of those pole-supported, beautiful houses in Studio City over the canyon. Deadly. There were deaths in these houses. Fortunately, not a lot of them, but hillside houses identified as an issue. Crawl space and living space over garage houses, pretty easy to give simple visual cues to homeowners to understand these. So this is where we started with our incentive programs. And we have in the CEA a pretty significant premium discount if you retrofit that crawl space house. Haven't worked it into the living space over garage situation yet. But the crawl space house, we have a discount of up to 25% if you retrofit this older house that's got a raised foundation, and you have either a contractor or engineer sign that it's been properly retrofitted. The kind of damage that we see in these crawl space houses is devastating. Studies 2.5 years later, not yet reoccupied. The 2-story house with wood siding is the worst. I asked Charlie this once. I said, my sense is that we are eliminating the 2 top reasons for fire following earthquake by bolting the house to its foundation and requiring that they take a look at that water heater to make sure it's been braced properly. I know that there are other ways that fires happen, Charlie, but really can go a long way towards reducing damage, this retrofit. So what is that number? What is that number? How did it lead to the 25%? We worked with PEER, the Pacific Earthquake Engineering Research Institute at Cal. We did a study and we said, quantify for us the reduction in damage to the retrofitted house. And just to take a magnitude 7 in San Francisco for this 2-story wood-sided house, $200,000 in reduction in damage for a $200 per square foot replacement cost, which is off by about a factor of 3. So we're talking about, close to $500,000 in reduction in damage. So keeping that house on its foundation. And remember, again, people always go, how could that be? Charlie mentioned we're being given numbers of 25 to 50% in demand surge. So that, the cost for you to paint every room in your house, take that and multiply that by a significant increase. So the mitigation incentive programs, we are jointly paired with California Office of Emergency Services through a joint power agreement. We have a program called Earthquake Brace and Bolt. I should have changed this. We just hit 25,000 today. We provide up to $3,000 for about a $5,200 retrofit for that crawl space house. We leverage our loss mitigation funding with FEMA funding. Our last grant from FEMA was $84 million. You can see we've done, a pretty good clip with that FEMA funding, and we just opened registration and intend to do another 6,000 houses this year. A little bit of a challenge in that when we mix our money with FEMA's money is Stafford funding and not taxable at the federal level. Our money is taxable at the federal level, so it makes it a little bit messy. But it's a really great model how an insurance institution or entity can be utilized to be kind of that, to kind of manage that local match and leverage that tremendous FEMA funding. So for 10 years, we've leveraged that funding. This is the retrofit that goes on under the crawl space, 2 to 3 days it takes, all done under the crawl space. Really designed for more than life safety in one way, in that where we could add improvements. The idea was that we would try and match the code in terms of the percentage of expected collapse at that very, very, very rare earthquake. There are those who would tell you that that percentage of collapse is overstated. And so we were trying to do something that was not always just life safety at its core, because what we're trying to do is to keep people in their homes, significantly increase the likelihood of habitability. We have developing programs. We have the Earthquake Soft Story program. We give quite a bit more money, $13,000 for that Earthquake Soft Story. And we just got word today, we've gotten $20 million in FEMA brick funding to stand up a multifamily incentive program. So that soft story, you add the garage on the lower level, you take out all the walls, including the one at the front, you create this terrible soft story condition. We've seen it in every single earthquake. We're putting in elements that you would put into a new house. We're putting in those stiff plywood or OSB walls and elements at the front of that wall. For the multifamily, this is the Northridge Meadows, of course, which was devastating, a loss of life in the Northridge earthquake, all done at the ground level. We are working with the Structural Engineers Association to select a design criteria that will be once again, it's not just kind of a collapse prevention, but once again, we're looking to as much as we can to increase the likelihood of habitability in these structures. And the advantage that we have with the cities who just declared mandatory ordinances is that we're bringing some funding. And so we feel that it is appropriate for us to be looking at a design criteria that, once again, that is pushing upwards as much as we can towards habitability. I just wanted to mention my idea that my personally called Vision 2050, it correlates to this functional recovery performance aims that's going on right now throughout the engineering and the earthquake engineering field, which is above life safety, which is saying, hey, we really need to be looking at more than life safety and damage control. So in residential, that means we should be looking to increasing the likelihood of habitability. I understand that infrastructure is very important if you don't have sanitation, water, electricity. But if we can try and take away the structural collapse, so that we're looking at as much as we can in houses, patch and paint, or kind of short-term recovery, short-term repairs, then we're starting to move towards that functional recovery in residential. And so I'm trying to somehow blend performance-based engineering, for those of you who are engineers, which essentially is just saying in the frequent earthquake for a kind of a typical house, it's going to be fully operational. Those are those little fours. The occasional earthquake, we want, to be operational, meaning, yeah, you could have some damage. For the rare earthquake, okay, now we're talking about the Hayward Fault. We're talking about the ones that we saw in Napa and Ridgecrest. Absolutely want life safety. And in that very, very rare, we want to make sure that we have just a few that are in near collapse. Well, what does it look like for insurance? For the pre-1940 houses that we're retrofitting in earthquake brace and bolt, I mean, we're talking about collapse over here. So we're not even, we need to move it quite a bit to the left, but we need to talk about insurance language. that's combined with the performance language of performance-based engineering. So I don't have any of these answers yet, and it's different for every type of structure. You can imagine there's so many different types of structure. That 3-bedroom house, I always call it the 3-bedroom house on a slab on grade with lots of walls where they haven't taken out the walls, does pretty well in an earthquake. It'll have damage on the interior, but that is not a collapse risk. You know, let's work on these collapse risks and then start talking about damage control. So with that, there's a lot of work for me to do to combine those. We wanted to leave some time for Mark to make some closing statements. I know that we haven't left a lot of time, but I know Charlie and I are easy to find on LinkedIn and the internet. If you have any questions, we can answer now.
Thank you,
Mark,
Janiele.
back to you.
Yes, and just if you didn't see in the chat, a note that Charlie was answering many questions in the Q&A section.
Good.
So please do look at those answers. Go to click on Q&A, then the answered tab. And let me just see if there's any there to highlight. But thank you very much, Charlie, for doing that. Questions about installing gas shutoff valves and you'll see a good answer there about other building loss types from the Northridge earthquake, such as building welds and tall buildings. And yeah, so just look for those. And I want to just highlight that this is, again, the second of our series of webinars. I'm going to share screen again.
Mark, Eric Davis has raised his hand. Does he want to say something? Is that possible?
Just one
should he-
second, Eric. Let me just share that our next webinar is going to be on June 12th, 12 to 1 p.m. And the link is there to where you can go and you can already register. I will put that into the chat. And the topic is going to be on 30 years of progress in quantifying seismic hazards by Youssef Bazornia, who's at UCLA. And there will be emails coming out about this to the same list that where you heard about today's webinar. There are many organizations promoting it. But you can be among the first to register. There's the link in the chat to join us on June 12th. We have another already planned in July and more to come. Be looking at our web pages and emails for those. Again, the overall series you can see at earthquakecountry.org/Northridge/events. And thank you all. We are at time, and thank you all for joining us today. Thanks again to Charlie Scawthorn and Janiele Maffei for their fantastic presentations. These will be on the website there as listed by next week, the recording and the slide sets. So have a great rest of your day.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.